Hello, everyone. Good morning if you are on Pacific time, and good night if you are on Indian time, and good evening if you are in South Africa. My name is Mudit Trivedi. I am assistant professor at Anthropology here at Stanford. It is my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the Center for South Asia to this event, which is part of a wider series on Oceanic Imaginaries, a talk series which is sponsored by the Center of Global Studies and includes a series of year-long events all year. The event today is focused on this wonderful book, which is edited and co-authored by our guests, whom I will introduce in a second. The book is entitled Oceans as Method, Thinking with the Maritime, and is published this year by Routledge. Now, as the book, before I move on, it is my duty to acknowledge that Stanford University sits on the unceded lands of the Muwekma. May the repetition of these acknowledgements aid in forging the sensibilities needed to address these wrongs and harms in the pragmatic and political ways they demand. Now, this event is focused on a wonderful, rich book, a book that issues quite distinct programmatics and projects. And as the title and the fact that it is co-authored by 4 authors across different disciplines suggests, it is a document of our time. It is a document that indicts our involvement across the social sciences, humanities, and other forms of and other disciplines with oceans in a new way. The book brings together scholars pushing at the limits of literary studies and history, and is rich in its contentions, in its ambitions, and in its formulations of what the authors are calling thinking oceanically. It is my hope that in this discussion today, we can come to a collective assessment of not only the many contributions of this volume, but also come to have a discussion about the affordances and constraints of what we might call this broader oceanic moment. So before anything else, it is my pleasure now to introduce our panelists. One of the co-authors, Sara Yapi, who is Program Officer at the Social Science Research Council in New York, is unfortunately not able to join us today. But with us, joining us in the late evening hours from India is, and I will introduce first Simi Malhotra, who is Professor and Head of the Department of English at Jamia Millia Islamia, Delhi. Nishat Zaidi, who is Professor of English at the same department at Jamia Millia Islamia, and Dilip Menon, who is the Mellon Chair in Indian Studies at the University of Witwatersrand and Director for the Center for Indian Studies in Africa. Now, for those who have not read the volume, I can introduce it effectively through the range of conceptual and metaphorical invitations and exhortations it makes. It invites us first, of course, to think of oceans as methods, to negate the categorical closures, the authors argue, of nation states and area studies, and to join a submerged, amphibious, oceanic, and maritime way of thinking, a way even suggested to be one of walking on water. The individual essays follow out very different senses of the ocean as concept, as the textual and experience sense of voyage, as the affective achievement of a historicist revision, as they try and stitch together an account of geographies of affinity across the archipelagic and aquatic connections they trace. The monograph thus certainly builds on Renisa Mawani's idea of method as residing in the metaphorical depths and fluid materiality of the ocean. And yet it is also at the cusp of a decade that has passed of oceanic studies and stands marking perhaps a change in the tides of the new decade and its new demands. And I hope we will be able to talk substantively about this paradigm in the question and answer. I know we are joined by a very rich set of attendees, and I encourage you to put your questions throughout the next half an hour throughout the next half an hour while the panelists are first speaking, and even afterwards in the question and answer dialogue. I will ask you to please keep your questions concise, and of course, keep them as respectful as you would like the answers to be. As the book we are gathered here, and as I've said, brings together quite distinct programs and programmatics, we have asked our wonderful authors who have joined us to first speak each for around 10 minutes. So over the next 30 minutes, I'll ask the authors to situate the volume, the long-term international and cross-disciplinary collaboration and conference it emerged from, and to speak about their own imperatives in making these sets of claims about oceans. In addition, I'd like to build on our missing companion in this arena, to build from Sara Sara Yappi's own piece in the volume, one in which Sara interviews four other early career scholars and asks them a series of questions. So in addition to what our guests have prepared, I'd like to ask them to also, if possible, briefly comment upon what does thinking oceanically mean to you? How and why did you come to this idea of foregrounding oceans in the way that you do? What commitments does this bring? And also, what commitments does it invite us to give up and why? So, without further ado, the floor is yours. As previously agreed, first it will be Dilip, then Nishat, and then Simi.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mudit. Thank you, Lalita and Simrit, for organizing this. And thank you to my colleagues and fellow collaborators for being awake at unearthly hours so as to make this seminar. So before I begin, I'd like to just briefly speak to the phrase as method, oceans as method. In our volume, we index the works of Isabel Hoffmeyer, who's my colleague here at the University of Witwatersrand, and also the work of Renisa Mavani, who is an academic in Canada, both of whom have expanded our understanding of how to write about the ocean. But the phrase itself goes back to the 1960s, an essay, China as Method, and it has reached this logical, absurd conclusion in a book that came out 2 years ago called Method is Method. So I think we've kind of exhausted that metaphor. That was the book edited by the geographer Carlos Rojas. I'll speak about three themes. The first theme that I'd like to speak to, but before that, the volume arose out of funding the Ministry of Education in India, which fosters collaborations between universities across the global south. So the University of Witwatersrand and the Center for Indian Studies in Africa, where I'm at, collaborated with Jamia Millia Islamia, the English department, Professor Nishat Zaidi. We held a series of workshops, courses, and so on. And then we held a conference. And this volume actually represents the distillation of the way in which we thought about this whole project. And I hope we're able to get that across in the brief time available to us. Now, Mudit has asked us to actually speak to why all of us in our individual capacities began thinking about the ocean. And I think the most pressing issue before us is the issue of global warming and the rising of the ocean waters, an issue that I address in the essay. The South African artist Gideon Mendel has a series of photographs called Drowning Worlds, where he looks at people in cities across the global north and south, global east and west, Australia, Norway, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and so on, standing in their houses with water up to their necks as the floodwaters rise. So this reminds us that this is not a problem of the global south or of the global north or the first world or the third world. When the waters rise, we shall all be subsumed. And as the biblical prophecy of the fire next time may not be what we need to worry about, it is the rising waters. So in that sense, the presence of terra infirma, the ground beneath our feet has become terra infirma, as the geographer Suvendrini Pereira pointed out. So once we see ourselves as situated in a very powerless state, afloat for a brief while on water, there is a necessity to move away from this, from terrestrial histories that we're used to writing and thinking with, towards addressing the issue of water and oceanic histories. And I'll speak first about the horizontality, and then I'll speak about the verticality, and what I mean will become clear by the end of this, I hope. So the first thing to think about is the fact that I come from the state of Kerala, which is on the southwestern coast of India. The origin myth of Kerala has this sage Parashurama flinging his axe into the ocean in order to recover land from the ocean. And all along the coast of India, you have stories of land being recovered from the ocean, land lost to the ocean, tales of lost cities. In the Sangam literature of the first millennium of the Christian era, you have the idea of the Kadangol, where the ocean reclaims the land. So these ideas of the rising of the ocean has been with us for a few thousand years, if not more. And for those who live on the coastline, the dangers of this are immediately evident. And it's becoming perfectly clear in our times that by the year 2050, projections say that cities like Mumbai, Kolkata, cities in Florida, all of them will be subject to the rising waters. So this needs us to focus on this issue of writing oceanic histories. And as Samuel Johnson said, there's nothing like the thought of execution the following morning to concentrate the mind. And I think that's really the situation in which this book came about. We also need to think ocean and nature as being phenomena that are not controlled by humans. Much of our social sciences is premised on this mastery over nature. This is something that Amitav Ghosh has written about plungently in his book, The Derangement, as well as Nutmeg's Curse. So when we think about the shifting patterns of typhoons, hurricanes, the changes in seasons which occasion floods, as much in Japan as in the US, I think there are ways in which we need to understand water itself and not just merely the oceans in its elemental sense and address that issue. The second issue that I want to take up is the fact of the partitioning that we are used to thinking with of area studies that, and this is a particular bane of the ways in which we do Asia, South Asia, you have the Association of Asian Studies, the Association of African Studies, and so on and so forth. And what has happened with oceanic studies is that even as it points to post-national, transnational histories of circulation and flow and fluidity and so on, we are still governed by the idea of working with the Indian Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean or the Pacific Ocean, each with its specific histories. So these connected oceans, to use Renisa Mavani's phrase, have been partitioned into particular histories, the Indian Ocean being the history of indentured labor, the Atlantic Ocean being the history of slavery, and so on and so forth. And what we need to understand is that the oceans are connected. And this is something that is very clear to a whale. Recent studies on whale song have shown how whales communicate their songs to each other across the depths of the ocean, so that songs are traveled almost as fast as the songs of the Beatles did in their time, right? So while humans partition the oceans in their hubris, the denizens of the ocean have a sense that the waters are all connected. And this happens willy-nilly as well. One of the examples I use in my essay is that of the Vartamana Pustakam, which is a Malayalam travelogue written in the 18th century, probably the first travelogue in any Indian language, which has these two adventurous priests set out from Kerala to meet the Pope in order to petition their case for the establishment of a bishopric in Kerala. They get onto the boat and they've never been to sea in their lives. Very similar to the Syrian migrants, the Syrian refugees who crossed the Mediterranean in 2015, as Ai Weiwei's interviews have shown, over 80% of them did not know how to swim, but they braved the waters of the Mediterranean. So these priests set out to go from Kerala to Rome, but the winds blow all the way to Brazil, to Bahia. They have no control over their itinerary. They go to Brazil, they meet some monks there, and because they're all part of the religious order, they engage in conversations about St. Augustine, and then they make their way to Rome, and then they come back. So this question of the ocean, the rhythm of the ocean, and human hubris that seeks to control it is an important question. So area studies also create certain kinds of occlusions. So if you think about the work of K.N. Chowdhury, who inaugurated the work on the Indian Ocean, it is remarkable that he does not speak about Africa at all. Right? There is a notion of the Indian Ocean minus Africa, and Africa is seen as being governed by its own rhythms, as it were. So the idea of connected oceans actually allows us to recover a truly global history and also to engage with something that is beyond that triad that governs our thinking of the pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial, which all hinge on the colonial. So I work with the idea of para-coloniality, of multiple times, of heterogeneous times, of moving beyond unreconstructed Hegelianism in some sense, or one time. And to think with the fact that even under the period of colonialism, there were multiple other activities, times of religion, times of trade, and so on. Finally, the question of verticality. This is where I would like to address what I believe are the shortcomings of my essay, because I write as a historian, we all write with the grain of our being. And after writing this essay, I've been reading more and more work. For example, Philip Steinberg's work on wet ontologies, Melody Jouet's wonderful book, Blue Media, where she actually learns deep sea diving in order to engage with the ocean. I do not know how to swim. I have never got my feet wet. So I think there is a way in which, how do we truly get the feet to the social sciences wet remains a question that I would like to address. The other question of verticality is also a very plangent political question that if you think about the fact of mining and the exploitation of the sea, vast tracts of the seabed under the aegis of the International Seabed Authority are being partitioned for the mining of polymetallic nodules, which will be used towards cell phones and electric cars and so on, so that the tiny island of Mauritius, as an extension of its seabed, has now become the 19th largest country in the world. So one last point is about, again, a shortcoming of my essay and probably ways of thinking. How do we create a theory that addresses the ocean? Our concepts are all terrestrial. Would engaging with the ocean allow us to create a new conceptual vocabulary? I'll stop here. Thank you. And now over to Nishat, who will take over.
Thank you so much, Dilip. Thank you for placing the book in perspective. My chapter takes the fundamental premise of the book further, which is to draw attention to the limitations of the territorial vision and the urgency for thinking with the ocean. And here it would be pertinent to reiterate the point that Charles Levery makes in her interview with Sarah Jeppe. Sarah is not here. This interview is there in Sarah's chapter, where she draws a distinction between thinking from the ocean and thinking with the ocean. Levery rightly points out that thinking with the ocean entails a back and forth conversation between material oceans and a resistance that comes from the still important land-based thinking. It is this amphibian approach that is deployed in my chapter to unpack the genealogy of the political formation of Muslim identity in the subcontinent from the oceanic perspective. And for the purpose, I have selected a few Urdu and Persian travelogues produced by Indian Muslims who embarked on the oceanic voyages in the late 18th century and so on. Many of them traveled as far as Europe via Egypt, Africa, Iran, Turkey, and other places in the Indian Ocean littoral region. Most members belong to the class of elite Muslims or Ashraf, and they sailed to England in the context of the entry of European colonial power in the Indian Ocean region that signaled the decline of Muslim sovereignty and hence shared a complex relationship with the empire. They sailed for reasons ranging from diplomatic mission, personal promotion, tourism, and pleasure to individual enlightenment and social service. I have examined their travel accounts to explore the complex web of subjectivities that frame the world of these travelers. It is important to remember that when these travelers embarked on their oceanic voyages, they left behind a tumultuous political background and a public sphere characterized by intellectual churning. The context of these travelers marked utter chaos and urgency for change and reform. My chapter argues that much as these travelers, confronted with the world of alterity in fluvial oceanic spaces, found their ideas of the normative constantly challenged and redefined, otherness experienced by them cannot be contained in the neat binaries of colonizer-colonized or even South-South collaboration. It was multidirectional with multiple sites of contestation and cooperation. The travel accounts that I have taken up and looked at in my chapter are Shigarf Nama-e Vilayat, or the Wonders of Vilayat, which is a Persian account of Sheikh Ittasamuddin, who traveled to Britain in 1765. There are a few slides which, if Simrat could just run so that people can take a look at all the travel accounts that were available and that I have sort of looked at. Yes, thank you, Simrat. So, I've closely looked at Shigarf Nama Vilayat, which is by Sheikh Ittasamuddin, who traveled to England in 1765. Then I have looked at Masire Talib Fi Bilad Afranji, which is a Persian account by an Indian prince of Persian descent, Mirza Abu Talib. You can move to the next slide. who traveled to England between 1798 to 1803. And again, the next slide. Tariq-e-Yusufi, the Urdu-Persian travelogue of Yusuf Kambal-Posh, who traveled to England in 1837-38. And yes, next slide, please. Right. And then Siyahat Nama, which is an Urdu travel account by Karim Khan, who traveled to England on a diplomatic mission in 1839, between 1839 to 1841. Then I have also looked at Musafirane London by Sir Syed Ahmad Khan, who traveled to England in 1869. My chapter has also referred to Lutfullah Khan's autobiography. It's called Autobiography of Lutfullah, a Mohammedan gentleman and his transactions with his fellow creatures, which was published in London in 1857 and is a travel account of his voyage to England as the secretary of Nawab Mir Jafar Ali Khan. Can we move to the next slide, please? Yes, this is about Lutfullah Khan. And the next slide. This is about Sir Syed Ahmad Khan and some details about him and why he traveled all the way to England. And again, the next slide. Yes, these are few other travelogues that I looked at, but not very closely. For example, one by Munshi Ismail, and then Karim Khan's travel account, Siyahat Nama, then Risale Ehwale Mulke Farang wa Hindustan by Abdul Azim Isfahani, which is Persian language. He was a Persian language tutor of Mr. Eliot. So these are a few accounts that were available to me and that I have looked at. Okay, we can close that. Thank you, Simrat. So moving on, some of the points that I have, tried to draw attention to through my readings of these travelogues is that usually travel narratives are viewed as always already implicated in the imperial project. However, I believe that the oceanic perspective allows us to rupture such a position. In my chapter, I have underscored the need to move away from the center-periphery paradigm and situate the travelogues in the context of these travelers and the circumstances that compelled them to undertake such long voyages, their mode of negotiating the difference in oceanic spaces, besides a focus on the materiality of the sea, port cities, littoral societies where their ships weighed anchor, life on aboard ships, and the ship itself. Secondly, we notice that the travelers make detailed observations about the superior navigation skills of the Europeans, especially the British, and the daily rhythm of life aboard ships. In fact, the luxuries of passengers traveling first class made these travelers intensely aware of what they perceived to be the ignorance and sloth of their own countrymen. Though overtly the travelers seem to suffer from Eurocentrism, it is difficult to miss the ambivalence of their attitude towards the British. And through various examples from these travelogues, I have tried to draw attention to this ambivalence. Thirdly, we notice that the Indian Ocean experience of the long durée of entangled histories of slavery, migration, trade, and religion, articulated through the experience of port towns and islands, complicated the sameness difference paradigms of reading when applied to these travel narratives. The travelers encountered people of diverse races, cultures, classes, and religions at various port cities and islands like Mauritius, Pegu, Malacca, Maldives, Madagascar, Cape Town, etc., where their ships anchored along the way for refurbishing supplies. These encounters made the travelers cognizant of deep histories of maritime exchanges and the temporal disjunctions and realignments caused by historical exigencies. They were challenged to reassess their own locations within this entangled material history and revisit their received notions of religious or class affinities. And fourthly, during 19th century travel across Indian Ocean was for Islamic modernists a key part of the project of constructing transnational Islamic identity. In this context, ships traveling across the British Empire became fraught sites of social change. Movement through the oceanic space made the Muslim travelers ontologically experience their religious identity in terms of food and clothing. As practicing Muslims, many difficulties of the travelers related to halal food and purification of the body to perform prayers. Besides, a constant fear of tragedy haunted ship voyages. The voyagers provide a planetary perspective where narratives are often controlled by the forces of nature and not by human authority or imperial authority or technologies. As these travelers traveled across the oceanic spaces, they discovered that oceanic space was also a war zone where the European imperial powers were competing to control maritime trade routes. Even the British or the hat wearing Firangis were not a homogeneous category for these travelers, as they were aware of the finer distinctions in the characters and habits of Britons, Scots, Irishmen, and their internal conflicts. Then ocean spaces also bring these travelers in contact with the larger Islamic world, and this is a very important, aspect that we get to see through these travelogues or Darul Islam. All Muslim travelers felt compelled to compare the all-pervasive presence of European imperial power in the Middle East with the fragility of the Ottoman Empire and the Khedive's rule in Egypt. Almost all of them point towards it. Mirza Abu Talib writes about the defeat of the Ottoman armies. Sir Sayyid feels very pained to see no sign of Muslim rule in Sicily, and so on and so forth. So as we move from the travelogue of Mirza Ittasamuddin, that is late 18th century, to Sir Sayyid's travelogue, which is late 19th century, we notice a growing political consciousness of Muslim collectivity. At the same time, I have argued that it would be fallacious to read these travel narratives as articulations of apologetic or any other alternative modernity, or even to suggest, as Niall Green does, that Muslims paradoxically rediscovered Islam in Europe. I find terms like reverse ethnography and counterflows equally problematic, as Hamid Damashi has also pointed out. Such views are an outcome of the core and periphery paradigm that has dominated discussions of non-Western literatures and cultures. To the contrary, the question of modernity in these travelers, as I have argued, involved a gap between theory and praxis of Islam. The early travelers indeed were oblivious of the regimes of homogenizing nationalism, and Qawm to them implied loosely a clan or religious community or a sect. At the same time, a sense of collectivity did begin to germinate under the colonial impact when geographical identities had become an arc in relation to which these travelers had to articulate their identity. Faisal Devji has used the term geographicity in his essay. While their travels might have been a private enterprise, embedded within the act of writing a travel account was a communitarian imperative. Their act of textualizing the account of their travel was inspired by a desire to rid their community of its intellectual and moral calcification. So to conclude, I have argued that the modernist impulse in these travelogues is articulated in their disavowal of the traditional perception of ocean as void, in engaging with maritime cultures, in textualizing and contextualizing the limitless and unbounded oceanic spaces as contiguous to and in interaction with territorial histories. The travelogues play a crucial role in underlining the transformative potential of oceanic spaces and historicizing the ocean. And therefore, I believe that these travelogues should be treated as alternative sources, both in ethnic as well as in political terms, with which we may exercise the Eurocentric specters of nationalist, universalist, or cosmopolitan claims, and reinstitute the overlapping polyphonic space of Indian Ocean, leading to what Pearson calls amphibious perspective on history. I'll stop here. Thank you so much. I will now pass on to Simi.
Thanks so much, Nishat. And thank you, of course, to Lalita and to Mudit and to Simrat for having all three of us here. And thanks also, of course, to all the work which has been done by Dilip and by Nishat in their presentations already. And so I'll take on from where they left off, which is that while Indian Ocean stands between the two universities that we belong to, that is Jamia and University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. And so Indian Ocean almost as if was there, as a talking point, and to talk about India and South Africa and South-South connection is something that came naturally to my vision of my work that I did for the book. But since one obviously is referring to Ocean as method, and Rena Samavani's work has already been invoked, as has rightly been the work by people like Isabel Hofmer and others who have talked about lateral networks, not only trading networks before indenture, but also of cross-cutting diasporas and desegregation of these diasporas in some senses. And so therefore, for me, what was natural to do was not to go to the usual route of talking about Gandhi and to talk about indenture from the 1860s onwards, but primarily to trace it back to those kind of possibilities of lateral networks and cross-cutting diasporas and desegregation that Isabel Hofmer speaks of. And that's exactly what I tried to do in the work that I carried out in my chapter, which is to not just to go back, let's say 2000 years or so, and to talk about, the more disputed kind of histories of Indians and primarily Dravidians in South Africa, and about the Hottentot people and the Quena community there. Also of, let's say, for example, a one-odd shipwreck of 1420s, where there was a South Indian ship which while crossing the Cape would have got shipwrecked, and there were some slaves who would have got deboarded there. But we do have documented proof of from 1550s onwards of a number of Portuguese shipwrecks, and also of a number of ships passing by the Cape of Good Hope, and primarily from the 1650s or so, especially after the setting up of the refreshment station by the VOC at the Cape, where the ships going from the East Indies and India to the Netherlands would make a stop. And therefore, we have this very, very rich history, especially in this particular time from 1650s to the 1850s or so, of a number of Indian slaves who would not just be there present for 200 years before 1860s in indenture, so to say, and not only did they were they there as slaves, but we also have documented proof, and these proofs actually exist in databases and archives which are available to us in today's time, where one sees that many of these slaves actually through marriage and through manumission would actually become free, and would themselves go on to become estate owners, would go on to themselves keep trades in some senses. And in that, I've looked at a number of other accounts, but primarily on two accounts of two women who I found were very, very interesting. One was, of course, Angela of Bengal. And of course, we know that many of them, they actually use toponyms from where they came, whether it's the Coromandel Cape of Coromandel or from Bengal. And Angela, of course, in documented history of Bengal is the first woman to actually have an estate in her name in Cape, and which is remarkable. Not only was she an erstwhile slave from Bengal, but she was also a woman of color in some senses, and she gets to own that particular estate. Apart from that, of course, we have this very, very interesting account, and this account is, of course, referred to in the novel itself by Teresa Benade, which is Kites of Good Fortune, which talks about Anna de Koning, who was Angela's daughter, and who went on to actually not only become a fairly rich estate owner herself, but probably one of the best known wine from South Africa, Groot Constantia, is the estate that she owned. And so we have this very rich history of this rich ancestry, where one can go back to Isabel's idea of cross-cutting diasporas and of lateral networks, which predate indenture in some senses. Besides that, of course, we also have names like Clark himself, the erstwhile president, who in his own autobiography would go back to his own history and would talk about his own ancestry and would talk about Diana of Bengal. Apart from these histories of slave trade, we also have other, and that's of course a free family, and we have history of Kalaga Prabhu, who was with the conflict that he had with Hyder Ali as a political exile, would come to South Africa, and so we have this history as well. Besides that, of course, I also refer to, and I really don't have the luxury to go into all the details, but it's also very interesting that we have the establishment with the later waves of indentured laborers and also of later passengers, so to say. We have the setting up of the DRC. We have the setting up of the church, which is interestingly, even though it comes with the English, so to say, but it so easily actually finds finds itself comfortable with the denomination of the Dutch Church, which already speaks about this older history. And this is something that I've written about in an earlier article, which I published in 2016, of this establishment of the Irish Republic Church, or the RCA, or the DRC, and that itself speaks about this particular history that is so interesting in some senses. And so what I tried to do in my engagement in this chapter was not just to go back to this idea of pre-indenture linkages that existed, this intermingling, this fluidity, this amorphity that René Samevani and others like Isabel Hoffner talk of, and to look at this particular rich history of exchange and co-mingling which exists and tells us and gives us so much of rich data about this particular period. But I also wanted to end my presentation with what I think is also important, which is not just to talk about ocean as method, but to also talk about ocean as affect. Because ultimately, if there is an affect to be produced out of the historiography that we seem to be engaging in when we talk about the Indians in South Africa or the Indian Ocean, so to say, one needs to also be able to talk about the ends of history. One needs to be also able to talk about the affect of history. And in that, I refer to primarily three registers. One is, of course, Gandhi himself and his idea about oceanic action or oceanic politics in some senses. And I'm sure everybody here is aware of his theorization against, as opposed to the idea of a pyramidal structure of networks, his idea of the concentric circles, which he would have probably got from the idea of the oceanic imagination from his experience in South Africa itself. And then, of course, there is this whole idea and account of oceanic feelings, which is referred to by Freud in his Civilization and its Discontents. And there's this very nice exchange between him and Romain Rolland about he using this term of oceanic feeling, which takes him back to his theorization of, as opposed to what Rolland would talk about in terms of institutionalized religion and church, the idea of an oceanic feeling, which is linked to the idea of oceanic religion or oceanic spirituality. And I think this is very important for us, especially in our troubled times where we talk about so much of sectarian politics today, to be able to probably go back to the idea of an oceanic feeling, which we can draw from this kind of an imagination, which can probably hint towards a different kind of an ethics and politics itself for our own times, rather than structured religions or structured identities of South African or Indian or whatever other sectarian categories that we may want to invoke. And then, of course, I will end by talking about what Walter Benjamin talks about in terms of oceanic thinking or oceanic thought itself. And this also, I think, is an important oceanic affect that we need to probably talk about, which is that what is ultimately the use of historiography? What is the use of education in some senses, if not to talk to our times? And already Dilip had talked about climate change and about how we need to think with water, not just in terms of method, but also probably in terms of oceanic affects themselves. And this is where I will stop my presentation. Thank you. Over to you, Mudit.
I think I can speak for everyone in the webinar that was a pretty incredible 30 minutes, because all of you so effectively summarize the richness of your concerns and the richness of your engagements. And I will encourage everyone in the audience. I can see that a few questions have started coming in, but while we talk for the next 10 minutes, please gather your thoughts and pose your questions. And just to get our discussion started, maybe I wanted to just say that all of the papers in the volume, in the way that you just so ably summarized, make a claim to be moving beyond in many ways. And it is this beyond that I hope I would, that maybe we can start talking about, especially given where you left us, Simi. The moving beyond the nation state, moving beyond the international order, moving beyond the fixity of maps, land and boundaries, moving beyond the closures of what are the categorical analytics that all of you have described, is also equally matched by what Dilip said in his presentation, move to a new grammar of concepts. And my questions, just to open up our conversation, are really just about where this new grammar of concepts arises from, and how it relates to the hard-fought victories of, say, previous epochs of scholarship. And maybe one place to start would be to just invite you all to say more about so much that is tacitly said in the essays and was also said here, to just ask you to say more about colonialism. Because Dilip, you talk about the paracolonial as resisting the abbreviation of historical time to the conjecture of the colonial. You also mean by it, I think, what you say exceeds the colonial encounter.
Right.
Simi, you talk about the polycolonial as a way I understand kind of drawing our attention to how comparative colonialism itself is not adequate to the braided experience of competing colonialisms and competing enslavements in some ways. And Nishat, your wonderful account leads us through the kind of how the mastery of the ocean by the Europeans informs the desires for the intimacies that all your travelers have. The pedagogics of the voyage, the induction into a modernist problem space of politics rests primarily on the fact that colonialism itself emerged as through the domination of the seas. And I was wondering if you could all, in some small way, reflect about how the idea of the oceanic, the exhortation to its new provocations, relates to our analysis of colonialism, its assemblages, and its tactics. How does oceans help us with that essential project? And what forms of power does the oceanic render visible? I'll leave it there in the most broadest formulation. Please go in any direction that you would like.
Would you like us to go in any particular order, or just go for it? A free for all.
I will go with the fluidity of the oceanic conversation here.
That's very democratic. I think maybe we can just go in the sequence that we spoke, and that will help sort out any confusion. See, I think you've raised a very important set of questions, and I think this book is a preliminary investigation in that sense of how do we move beyond the ways in which the ocean has been written about, because there's a very rich literature which looks at slavery, piracy, it looks at trade, it looks at the fluidity of religion. We have increasingly more and more work speaking about Indian Ocean Islam, which expands the geography of Islam in India towards the Middle East, East Africa, and so on and so forth. But I'd like to address three particular questions that you raised. One is that of this grammar of concepts, and I think there are ways in which the ways in which we conceive of history arise from our agrarian origins of civilizations, as also of the advent of industrialization. So a lot of concepts are centered around land, around agriculture, around state, around community, all land-based, as well as the idea of capital, which is, again, as we know, is a global phenomenon, but is located in the origins of industrial capitalism in particular locations, geographical locations, and so on. So what would it mean to actually engage with a history that is not centered in particular territories, in the growth of particular political formations, nor indeed in the growth of particular economic kind of formations? So to take an example, in the 1930s, the literary critic Balakrishna Pillai in Kerala begins to write a history of Kerala, and his first chapter is set in Rome. Right? So this is a kind of an explosion, an exploding of a particular geography. It's an exploding of a particular time, because to write about contemporary Kerala, why go back to Rome? And here he is signaling to the incorporation of the southwest coast of India into the larger rhythms of the ocean, the fact that in the wars between Rome and Carthage, tribute was paid by Carthage in pepper to Rome. That pepper came from Kerala. So he asked the question that actually circulates through a lot of my work: is Kerala a chapter in the history of Rome, or is Rome a chapter in the history of Kerala? Right? I mean, this is much before post-colonial theory and its decentering of the universe. So that's one kind of question which actually explodes space and time. The other thing to think about is also, and I'll stop with this example, is for me the fact that while we have the understanding of the world as governed by nations and the emergence of new nations and the relations between nations, such as I deal with when I teach international relations, that there is a lot of other movements that happen alongside, which are related to the kinds of migrations which laugh at borders, as it were. So if you think about the Cambodian boat people, you think about the Rohingyas, you think about the Syrians walking across the Mediterranean, you think about the Sri Lankan Tamils expelled by the civil war in
Sri Lanka over a period of over 2 decades, who then find their way to Capri, to Toronto, and so on and so forth. We have a kind of movement that is very similar to that of the movement of the first anatomically modern humans 40,000 years ago from the continent of Africa, right? When the first humans land up in Polynesia, for example. And if I had a map, if I had a slide, I could show you how contemporary migrations are very similar in the ways in which they map onto the world as 40,000 years ago. And this is a figure that I like to show in class, that there is something that we have to think with much longer time spans. So the question that comes for us, and I'll stop here, is how far back do we have to go in order to write a history of the present? Right? And very often we take bite-sized chunks, the colonial, the pre-colonial, and so on. The pre-colonial, of course, seems to extend all the way to the dinosaur, if one lets it. The colonial, of course, is a limited period of 400 years, but the histories of humans actually transcend these divisions that we make. Nishat, would you like to say something?
Yes, thanks, Dilip. You're right. Uh, and when we think about colonial in the context of these Muslim travelers, it's very interesting that these travelers, even though overtly, I mean, they speak in double tongue most of the time, even though overtly they are all praised for the technological progress that the West has made, they are also attentive to the problems of, let's say, attitudes, character, and they comment on almost every aspect of the life of these colonial masters. So this civilizational paradigm, that colonialism is associated with, is ruptured very often in these travelogues. For example, they talk about the printing press, for instance, in the West, and Mirza Abu Talib, he's critical of how the Western scholars have misused printing press, and at one point he says that as soon as any one of them acquires the smallest insight into the principle of any science, he just jumps to publishing a book on that, and that has done much harm to knowledge. So it's not that they are full of any kind of awe for the colonial powers, and they keep questioning and puncturing it within their narrative. Similarly, Mirza Abu Talib wrote a treatise on women in the West, and he was surprised to see the difference between the liberties that women enjoy in the West and the way women are veiled in India. But then he's not critical of his own society. Rather, he says that, well, free intermingling of men and women in English society is because English or British are parochial in nature, because they have been placed in one corner of the globe where there is no coming and going of foreigners, whereas in a place like India, it has been a center of so many movements. So that kind of counter narrative that you notice in these travelogues, it sort of punctures the dominant perspective about colonialism that we have, especially about the response of the native intellectuals towards colonialism, that they were all subservient to it, etc. So that you don't get to see in these travelogues. Okay, Simi?
Right. Thanks, Dilip and Nishat for So Mudit, of course, as you rightly said, that it's not the colonial movement only, and when one talks about a decolonial politics and a politics to come in some senses, of course, there's already been talk of extra-colonial or para-colonial or polycolonial, and the reason why I'm drawn to the idea of the polycolonial is that not only the experience in India, let's say, for example, not just of the British, but the Dutch and the Portuguese and the Danish and the tells us a different story of this polycolonial. And Nishat herself also spoke about this competing not just on terrestrial land, but also in waters, which is also a history which probably one needs to talk about. But I think also in today's time, especially to the politics of today, of global politics, where one talks about global powers and global, and not just, centers really in that sense, I think colonial politics probably talks to us better and gives us the tools to be able to talk to us better about multiple powers, rather than to talk about, the idea of an erstwhile colonized and, colonizer, that kind of a binary in some senses. So I think for me, the immediate impulse of this idea of the polycolonial comes precisely from our own location in time and place now. And that's why, for me, the idea of the oceanic affect is so important, because it's not just simply a question of method, but it's also a question of what affects do we want to produce out of the scholarship that we engage in, to be able to talk to our times and our places now here.
Thank you all for such generous and substantive engagements with the question. And I have questions still about power and authority, about relation and affinity, and about affect. So I want to come to them, but I think there are questions already accumulating in the chat. And in the spirit of oceanic engagement with questions that are arising from many shores, maybe we should address them first, and perhaps we can close with one of mine, if there is still time. I want to maybe ask you to engage two questions together. David Stanford asked that the place of nature in ocean-oriented scholarship today is not so straightforward. Ocean studies in various forms encourages us to think about the alterity of seawater, about ocean spaces and marine creatures. My concern is that our work, the ocean culture binary, often reinscribes the nature culture binary and directs us to Gilly Paulson's statement of the ocean as an aquarium, and how might ocean methods approach human entanglements. And if with that I could pair another question by Arzan Tarapore, I wonder if you, and he's directed it also at Dilip, could reflect on the idea of dividing oceans, which is certainly that Dilip you mentioned, the utility versus the artificiality of the Indian versus the Pacific, and whether the Indo-Pacific is a useful concept at all or not. So maybe we could do these, and I will say there are a few questions. I will invite the audience to say more. So we are limited by the time we have, but please address them as you feel best.
So again, I suppose we could take it in the order that we spoke. I think the first question is an important one, because we always see the ocean as being out there, in some sense, distinct from land. And in many senses, we connect the histories of the coastline with that of the ocean. So when we talk about cosmopolitanism, for example, we are very aware that on the East African coast, the Swahili coast, which is one of the most distinctly cosmopolitan areas, that, as Abdul Razak Gurna pointed out, that the cosmopolitanism does not extend beyond 30 kilometers into the hinterland. So one is also aware of the fact that the separation of the land from the sea is both distinct, right, as in the case of the Swahili coast, but also the fact that land continues to be haunted by the sea in many senses. So the ocean is present in the land. So if, for example, if one is at a dargah, for example, at a Sufi shrine somewhere listening to a qawwali, right, in Rajasthan, in the middle of the desert, you're aware of the sonic scape that summons up the histories of movement of Islam across the ocean, so that you find these trains of music coming to us not only from the Silk Route, but from the ocean. So in that sense, there are many ways of thinking this issue, and I'm aware that we are kind of rushing through this whole thing, and this is all merits a much longer conversation. The second thing I think you brought up, which is a very important point of this nature-culture division, that we somehow, that how do we actually engage with the ocean and its creatures as, in terms of the new turn in the way in which we do social sciences, where we look at dependencies and porosities rather than these hermetic spaces of whether it is of land and water, of humans and animals. How do we engage with that relationship? And that's again something that I think is probably a shortcoming in this volume. We wrote as historians and as literary critics and so on and so forth. And I am now beginning to read more and more of this work that looks at animals in the ocean, looking at fishing, looking at the ways in which human beings have engaged with the creatures of the ocean, not only in terms of consumption, but in terms of creating mythic imaginations. So the presence of the oceanic creatures within landed mythologies, and the ways in which that entanglement of life as well as of the spirit spaces, all of these become crucial. So we're moving to a space that social sciences has been wary of engaging with, given the disenchantment of the world. How do we think with the notions of ancestors, of spirits, and so on, and also engage with forms of thinking that lie outside the ken of the social sciences, indigenous thought along the coastline. For example, on the southwestern coast, you have the whole histories of worship of ghosts, of slaves who have come from elsewhere and died on the coastline. So you had the whole history of slavery from the Portuguese and the Dutch period onwards, slaves from Africa, from Southeast Asia who are transported via India into other spaces and so on. So I think animals and creatures in the ocean. Now this is something that I'm putting before you. There's more work that needs to be done, but
Dilip, you're cutting out. If I could just ask maybe Simi or Nishat to go while your internet becomes stable again.
Okay, Simi, would you like to go first or should I go first?
Go ahead, Nishat.
Okay, so there are a few questions, a couple of them addressed to me directly, and one which is not addressed to me directly, but maybe I can touch upon that. One is the issue of
Absolutely.
gender. Yeah, one is the issue of gender. As far as these travelogues are concerned, you see, they present a very complex picture of the attitude of these travelers towards gender, because probably they all belong to the ashraf, elite, upper class, upper caste, sayyid, and patriarchal setup. So that perhaps is the reason why in early travelogues, let's say Kambal Posh, wherever he goes, he falls in love with women, and he compares beauties of French women with British women, etc., etc. So women are always, whenever he invokes women, they are mostly, African women, very racist. His attitude is very racist. But at the same time, we also have Mirza Abu Talib, who actually, wrote this article, this essay, which he got translated into English during his stay in England and got it published there. So that sort of tells the passion that he had towards proving that Indian women were better off than what the way they were presented in the Western public sphere. So the title of his essay was "Vindication of the Liberties of Asiatic Women." So this, in a way, sort of was a reversal of the usual colonial gendered assessment of European and Indian societies that circulated at that point of time. So we have this very, but Sir Syed, much later, he traveled much later in 1860s. When Sir Syed goes, he is full of praise for his landlady who reads newspapers, and he reviews that Indian women waste away their time. So most of the time they're comparing women, Western women with Indian women in terms of education. So education by that time has become quite important. So we have this very complex picture when it comes to gender as far as these travelogues are concerned. Secondly, there was a question about Islam and religion, and attitude towards religion. As I pointed out, most of the time these travelers, they refuse to accept the superiority of Christianity over Islam. They in fact, most of the time, ironically, they are the ones who are pitching for a secular approach, whereas most of the time time they are drawn into religious circles by their co-travelers, priests. For example, in case of Kambal Posh, it was Father Mortimer, and who was very sad that the Hindus and Muslims in India do not convert to Christianity. So he said that they do not convert to Christianity because they are already follower of a good religion, enlightened religion. And he says that just as Christianity is a good religion by itself, but does not have any steadfast follower, the real fault lies with the followers of Islam. So if at all there are problems with Muslims in terms of their lifestyle or their practices, the fault does not lie with Islam, but it lies with the followers of Islam. The same attitude you get to see so many years later in Sir Sayyid also, as well. Sir Sayyid, who was a votary of reason and rational attitude towards religion, etc. But when it came to writing, I mean, one of the primary motive of his travel to London was to write a response to Muir's book on the Prophet. So he privileges asnad, which is the textual authority of the past, instead of resorting to reason and scientific arguments. He resorts to asanad or textual authority. So that never really loses its value. Most of the time, the attitude of these travelers is that the fault lies with the practices and not with the religion. And if at all there is any reform needed, the reform is needed not in religion per se, but in the malpractices that have entered the community. So it's the community that needs to be reformed, not the religion. And they continuously refer to the authority of hadith, Quran, and so on and so forth. So that is about religion. Then third question was, thank you, Priya, for asking that question that has really made me think. I haven't really given much thought to it so far, but my submission at this point would be that maybe when we look at Muslim travelers, the perspective has to be different as compared to, let's say, Dada Bhai Nauroji or other travelers, because Islam already has this concept of ummah, right? The larger Islamic world, Qawm, ummah, which is the Islamic nation. So when they are traveling, they are continuously comparing the European dominion with the Islamic authority, right? So which would not perhaps exist in be available for other travelers. So that is, I think, where I would draw a line between Muslim travelers and other travelers. Thank you so much.
Nishat, thank you so much for taking on the wonderful questions by my Stanford colleagues, Usha Iyer, Anubha Anushri, and Priya Satya. And I just wanted to name them so that I can thank them for their participation. Simi, before we go to you, if I could just reframe some of the conversation, because maybe draw it back to where you had left off in your previous comments about the nature of the decolonial enterprise that might be associated with the Oceanic. If you could just also address something that Usha mentions in her question about what specific forms of intersectionality does the Oceanic attention to relation, connection, and affinity actually help us address? Because there's a lot of that in your own paper, where I if anyone is interested in the inner Bengali Creole that is at the heart of the Afrikaner soul, I will encourage them to read Simi's incredible paper. But if you could address either the intersectionality question or also, I would say that the question that we have open from Bala Niku, which says that question is how we apply ocean as method and maritime as metaphor for power and the analysis of power. And I thought not just global power and politics, but since Simi, you were talking about the kind of a reflexive attitude towards our own enterprises and our own concepts, but also the affective work it does. And I'd like to return to that, but if you could address any of these, then I would be glad.
Right. Thanks, Mudit. So I'll just begin by responding to what Usha asked about the question of gender, and I thought that I should clarify this, that when I was talking about Angela of Bengal, and she was actually a slave, and so she was not really from the elite background, and she actually went on through manumission and then subsequently through marriages. And there's a very interesting history, and I hope one can recover that history of these many marriages that these women enter into, and many children that they go on to bear, and how they change their fates through those marriages. And of course, Anna de Koning's story is different because she went on to actually have a huge estate. And as I was speaking about the Groot Constantia estate that she owns, but that she owned, and she herself kept around 60 odd slaves. So it's not really one story there in terms of gender and sexuality. There are many stories of marriage, of sexuality, of how women negotiated that space. So that's of course a very interesting kind of history itself. And I think that brings us, and I don't really address that question, though I think it's an important question that Usha asked about the question of caste itself, because we do have some registers of religion, which kind, or some account of religion, but I think we still don't have enough account of caste to be able to actually map out that particular past in terms of that history. But I think that would be an interesting thing to look at as well. But to me, Mudit, I mean, coming to the question that you spoke about, which is the whole idea of oceanic affect, and I think that for me is very important. And I'm glad that Dilip spoke about that, because in the response that he was making to the first question, it was asked about this opposition between nature and culture, and how there's always a danger of lapsing into certain binaries which one wants to certainly sidestep while invoking the idea of oceanic affect, and to be able to talk about a different kind of politics and ethics in some senses. I think there is a need to go beyond some of the reading formations that we have in some senses, and that's why probably, I mean, even the colonial moment for me is not the most important moment to be able to even talk about polycoloniality or decoloniality as the only register through which one needs to probably think about politics and ethics today. And I think an oceanic, and especially when one talks about planetarity or climate change, allows us that possibility to be able to actually step outside this particular history in which we often tend to get mired because of our own locations, probably in the global south. And I hope that in the work that probably needs to be done in terms of being able to talk about the oceanic affect, one will be able to take it beyond the moment of polycoloniality or extra-coloniality or paracoloniality, and to be able to sidestep this colonial baggage which we seem to probably carry, and to be able to actually connect to global issues of planetarity, of the Anthropocene, of climate change. And I think that's probably the direction in which a lot of our studies probably needs to be geared towards. And I hope that that's where probably we'll be going. So, yeah.
Dilip, if you were saying something, I think you're muted.
I've unmuted. May I come in at this point?
Of course.
Yeah, no, because you asked the question of power, and I think this is an important question also because many of the study, if you think about the work of Marcus Rediker, for example, and you think about questions of the ship and control and hierarchy on the ship, I think there is a way in which we kind of translate relations of power on land onto the ship. The ship becomes a kind of microcosm of the land, whether you're talking about slavery or we're talking about they've been pirate ships and so on and so forth. But I think there are other ways of thinking about power without lapsing into very kind of etiolated kind of conceptualizations of the sea as being a free space of circulation, flow, and so on and so forth. We would get caught up in our metaphors. But if you think about, for example, the Moby Dick, the novel, right? You have the hierarchies on board the ship, right, which are premised on power. There is the pursuit of the whale, which is also based on power. The entire whaling industry was rooted in, the early capitalism. It was also rooted in a certain attitude towards nature, right, which we are now beginning to rethink of man's or human dominion over nature. But at the same time, the ship is also at the mercy of other powers, of the waves, of the winds, and so on and so forth. So I think this question of trying to understand the question of power in a much more pervasive and how should I put it? Where we move away from those binaries of humans and nature to understanding the forces of nature as they act upon us. Otherwise, we shall be left only with these notions of power that come from
human domination. So, for example, there are many studies of capitalism on the ocean. And also when we think about Lale Khalili's wonderful work on looking at port containers, the container shipping, sorry, then you begin to think about the kind of translation of the operations of capital and labor, but now not on land, but on the ocean. So I think the question of power has to be addressed in a much more fundamental sense. And I think, as I said, this is just a preliminary kind of inquiry. And I think there is not enough historiography for me to draw upon, but I think there are questions that we all need to ponder on. Meanwhile, I must apologize for my general frantic dissociation because I have no electricity at home, which went off all of a sudden, which is why I appear as if I'm in a German expressionist movie with lit from below. And I hope my voice is coming through to you. I'm talking on my
You're
cell phone
fine,
right
Dilip.
now.
You're
Okay,
fine. Thank you
thanks.
for making the adjustments. Maybe I can just draw on some of these for a final round of questions, maybe. And perhaps we could go in the order of Simi, Nishat, and then Dilip in this round in some ways. And
Yeah.
I'm interested in how the concatenation of metaphors of multiplicity, of fluidity, of overlapping and polyphonic, and this quest to find another grammar with which to address power, and yet also to address all the urgencies of our times, to disinvest ourselves of of the anthropos and its narcissism, to address the coming tide, as it were. And I want to just talk about a little bit of the immanence of water, the openings it provides, and yet the reflexivity that also the volume invites us to. To also, Simi, you do this so well towards the closing of your piece, where you ask us if the oceanic is to be an academic affect, then it is also an achievement that we affect. And there's something very astute when you say that, there are parts where you say at the end of your speculative account of oceanic encounter and assimilation at the Cape, you move aloud. And I think it's quite valuable for us to think of it. There's also the volume ends there, but also maybe our conversation can open out a few thoughts there. Your engagement with Freud to Benjamin, you ask us to consider whether this oceanic feeling as it rises in contemporary humanities and social sciences, whether it's actually, and I'm paraphrasing you here, if it's a quest for pre-colonial innocence. And then you also ask us whether it's an escapist form of stepping away or sidestepping certain problems that we have. And I want us to maybe just think about, in the way that Dilip said at the start, that, method as a metaphor, method used to be, the regular remedy you could have for a disease before something called the sciences made it into a protocol. So if we could just think a little bit about where is our oceanic quest headed, especially given that the cruelties are, that mark the certainties of our present are enacted in an intersectional way that demands our attention. And as much as climate injustice will follow, the nation state is equally important to the fascist presence. And how might we not just sidestep, but the immanence of the ocean, how might it return us to the analytics that we need to talk about as well? And any thoughts on those fronts, I would invite from all three of you. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Mudit. I'm so glad that you're actually asking this, because this is really what is close to my heart. Now when I think that if I were to rewrite that paper, I would probably start off with where I end rather than where I began. But for me, the question of ocean as method is not as important as ocean as affect, as probably they've all also guessed from what I've been saying. It's very interesting that that in the letter that Freud exchanges with Romain-Rolland. Romain-Rolland, of course, is very, very positive about his embracing of the idea of oceanic feeling, as opposed to Freud's own conception, and which one understands, of course, keeping in mind his own theorizations about pre-Oedipal, pre-linguistic, idea of pre-lapsarian identity as something which he would not necessarily couch in terms of pathologies, but of course, in the way in which we receive Freud, we probably think of it as pathological. But I think for me, the reason why it's important today to speak of not really going back to some idea of innocence, the idea of a pre-lapsarian, pre-linguistic, pre-symbolic idea of, oceanic feeling, which is Probably that allows us the possibility of being able to sidestep, very, very strong identity politics, very, very strong sectarian politics, which also kind of mires us, as caught as we are in our nation states, or in our own insular, kind of very, very regressive kind of identities in some senses. So I think the reason why I invoke the idea of civilization and its discontents and what Freud speaks about in terms of oceanic feelings is not really to go back to some idea of innocence in some senses, but to think of ways in which one can think of politics and ethics today in our post-anthropocentric, climate justice-oriented planetary times, where one can probably think of going back to not just the metaphor of the ocean in terms of oceanic feelings, or the idea of an oceanic spirit in that sense, but probably to think of politics or ethics to come, which can take us beyond this identity politics, which kind of is something which informs our fascist times where we are located. So it's primarily from that thinking, and that's why for me Benjamin's idea of the role of education or the role of knowledge itself as producing that oceanic thinking is so important, and that's where I ended my presentation, and that's for me is probably the only hope that one has for our times, our very difficult times otherwise, in that sense. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. Nishat?
Yeah, thank you, Simi. No, I'm just thinking in the context of especially Islamic world, because my chapter is about Muslim travelers. And when I looked at 19th century travelers, people like Hali and Ghalib, they had invoked the great voyages of Muslims in 7th, 8th century, 7th to 10th century, who travel, traveled all the way to Spain and other places and conquered lands, etc., etc. And when we juxtapose that with the contemporary Islamophobia and the refugees, most of them, majority of them happen to be, Jordanians or Palestinians or other, and the rest of the Islamic world. So it's a strange contrast that you see, ocean and oceanic voyages that were used to create that, Islamic world, and then, a counter to that again, these people resorting to illegal migration through oceanic travel. I think again, what happens most of the time is that we exert our terrestrial and territorial ideas on ocean, and even when we travel via the ocean, we carry our world with ourselves. So ships become the Dilip referred to ships, for instance. Ships become these small territorial places where the same power dynamics and power structures are played out as on land, until the time when the forces of nature dictate otherwise. And that is why most of the time the travelers, they keep referring to Haq Ta'ala and so on and so forth, referring to God Almighty, because it's only there only the powers of God can control nature. The jurisdiction of the imperial authority fails. So that perspective, I suppose, is it's important to reinforce that, to draw a limit of human control. So oceanic perspective, I think, for me, leads us to the point where we become aware of and cognizant of the limitations of all these this violence, and that is causing so much of displacement, uprooting, environmental crisis, and so on and so forth. So that is what oceanic perspective can lead to, and especially in the context of the Islamophobia and migration of Muslim refugees from one place to another. Dilip, sorry. Yeah.
Yes, actually, we have to play tag here, right? So, Mudit, you've asked a very profound set of questions, which I don't think can be answered immediately in the context of a brief seminar. And I'll treat them as comments for us to do more work, and also probably to expand the range of the ways in which we think about the ocean. But the two things that I would like to say, one, engagement with the idea of the ocean, which I think is fundamentally necessary in India right now, is that when you think about the conception of India, the map of India, which for most nationalist stretches from Kashmir to Kanyakumari, from Gujarat to the northeastern state, there is a way in which that map doesn't include the ocean. And for me, there is a particular reason why that terrestrial map, with history that is taken back to the Vishnu Purana and classical Hindu texts, is it conditions a certain kind of Hindu nationalist imagination, because the ocean is what brings in the Jew, the ocean is what brings in the Muslim, the ocean is what brings in Christianity. And there is a way in which bringing the ocean reminds us that the world is constituted of a hugely miscegenated humanity and of multiple histories. And India, in India's case, the writing out of the ocean has deep political implications. Greg Denning, who wrote on Australia, spoke about how, if you think about the history of Australia, I mean, Australia was made through the arrival of British convicts who then commit genocide. There is a decimation of native indigenous life. But in the Australian imagination, the sea is the beach, suntan, bronze bodies, and surfing. There is a forgetting that happens there. So in many ways, the writing out of the ocean actually congeals histories of power and genocide. And in India, the increasing nature of the increasing violence of Hindu majoritarianism. So that's one point. The second thing is something that is much more relates to the ineffable, because it has always struck me, since for those of us who listen to Hindustani classical music or Carnatic classical music, the most fundamental metaphor of a cosmic belonging is the ocean, right? The idea of the Ksheerasagara, or the appeal to an oceanic imagination within which all living creatures, where there are no binaries between the human and divinity, there is no binary between the human and the animal. It is the nature of cosmic belonging, and that grasping of the ineffable becomes possible to us through the ocean, and probably is an indicator of a method that we could probably try and think about. I'll stop there.
I want to thank all our panelists, not only for the volume, but for the nature of their engagements, and also for the audience. I will say that everyone who asked a question, these questions will be sent to all the panelists. So please treat this as the beginning of a conversation, not as the mere small missives of a webinar, which are truncated in space and time. But I also do want to acknowledge it is almost midnight in India, and a special thanks to Nishat and Simi for bringing this energy and this generosity across the Sat Samandar. It is my absolute pleasure to have been in conversation with you, where we have been able to think about not only a historiographic movement, but also think about what are oceanic urgencies, their pleasures and satisfactions, their commitments and complicities might have been. And in these ways, it is my pleasure to thank you for the invitation to reconsider these urgencies, to think about whether a method addresses disease or addresses concepts, and to think about ocean not just as method, but as mirror to our own affects in so many ways. And I invite everyone to start the conversation, to keep the conversation going that has just started. And in closing, it is my duty and it is my pleasure to thank Lalita Duperon, Simrat, and Anna Bigelow, all at the Center for South Asia, without whom none of these events are possible. I would also invite you to look at the Center for Global Studies year-long initiative called Oceanic Imaginaries. This is the first of many, many events, and they are wisely sourced from across the littoral. So thank you to everyone. The webinar format is not appropriate because there is no collective applause at the end. So I will fill in for everyone else who's on the call. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mudit and Lalita. Thank you so much. And Simrit.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, everyone. Thank you.